Oh, no, yes, I got you.
Oh, yay. Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us. Um,
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
we're not like professional Zoom people here, so we don't have like any kind of professional setup or ring lights or anything. So I'm just
Fair
gonna like
enough.
spin you around the room and kind of introduce you to my journalism students. Whoops.
Hello.
Um, who they
As
are.
a professional Zoom person, I also don't own a ring light. So,
That's okay. That's good to know. So this is like, imagine yourself here, you're in our classroom
mhm,
talking about how to make a good story. So what we just did just now was watch your HBO Real Sports story on youth mental health,
mhm.
which was a tearjerker to say the least. And we talked about the importance of stories and what sorts of things that they can change. They can be agents of change, and journalists can be agents of change, even journalists, or maybe even especially student journalists. So we talked a little bit about the importance of stories. We all thought your story was amazing, and the students came up with some questions to ask you. But before that, I was wondering if you might be comfortable just giving us a little bit of your background in journalism and talk a little bit about like who you are, what you do, and how you kind of came to be in the position that you're in now.
Yeah. Well, hi everyone. I'm glad to be here. I actually recently spoke at my high school English classes writing to make change class. So this is very similar. And it was actually a high school English teacher that helped me find that I was a good writer and would maybe be a good journalist. I was going to go into the sciences before that. So thank you to that English teacher. Very quickly, my background is I went to Columbia. I knew I wanted to be a sports writer as soon as I probably decided on not going into science, probably junior year of high school, and I applied to colleges in order to do that. And when I got to Columbia, full scholarship, all of that. I set foot into the offices of the Columbia Spectator, which is our daily newspaper, and I said I'm going to be sports editor here one day, and I was. So there's that, and it was really a class between my freshman and sophomore years of college. I had to petition to take a graduate school class about sports, and it was called the Socio-Historical Foundations of American Sports. And that was really the first time that I had been taught in an academic setting that there was such a intertwined connection between our history and our society and sports. Sports were just a fun thing that I grew up with, and then I took this class that really opened my eyes to broader themes, and that sports could really be a lens to examine broader things in society. And I as you do more journalism, no matter what the industry you're covering is, I think you'll come to find that the practices of journalism stay the same no matter what you're covering. And I'm not a beat writer. I don't cover how the Yankees did yesterday, or whenever we have baseball back. But I did get my career start at Bloomberg as a sports business columnist. So I was very much covering the intersection of sports and finance. And I was, for a time, I would say, a financial journalist. And that's really when you start to realize that I'm covering sports, but also as an industry, as a several billion dollar companies that exist within America and globally. I'm covering political bodies that govern them. It's not just about what's happening on the field. And my time at Bloomberg was extremely formative. I was the sports columnist there for 3 years, and had an amazing relationship with my editors, who were all like New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Washington Post veterans, and really just gave me foundations of how to do journalism properly, as somebody who didn't go to journalism school. And then after Bloomberg, I went to ESPN, and I was there for another 3 years. And I wrote for the magazine and for ESPNW, and I did regular appearances on Outside the Lines and a couple on Sports Center. And that was a very cool experience also, as somebody who had written very critically about some of the things that I had seen at ESPN, that they were still very open to having somebody come in and do exactly what I do and cover exactly what I cover. And then I left ESPN and joined The Athletic, And when I joined The Athletic, I joined when we were launching the sports business vertical. So I joined as a sports business reporter. And then maybe 2 months into it, I got a call about potentially hosting The Athletic's newly launching flagship podcast called The Lead. So I moved to Los Angeles to do that. And then the pandemic hit, so I moved right back home. But I hosted The Lead for about a year and a half. And that was the first time I'd ever hosted a podcast. It was a completely new skill, a new type of journalism, new types of stories that we were covering, but still within, the idea of sports being so much more than just what happens on the field. Very proud of the work that I did there. I won an Edward R. Murrow Award, a Gracie Award, a Webby Award while I was there. And my first book came out in September of 2020 that I co-wrote with Jessica Luther. It's called Loving Sports When They Don't Love You Back. And each chapter kind of deals with a different moral and ethical dilemma of sports fandom and the nature of sports fandom and how we kind of reconcile these dilemmas. That was absolutely thrilling. Publishing a book in the middle of a pandemic is a whole other, could write a book about that, frankly. But, and then, I started doing work on Real Sports, which has been just an absolute thrill, and I say to people, when I was a little girl and wanted to be a sports writer, there were 3 shows that I wanted to be on. And you guys are all going to be too young to remember any of these, but one is The Sports Reporters. That was a show on ESPN every Sunday that was hosted by the late John Saunders. That just had 4 different sports reporters from around the nation talking about, the biggest topics of that week. The second was Outside the Lines on ESPN back when it was hosted by Bob Lee. And as I said, I was lucky enough to be on OTL quite a few times. And the third was Real Sports with Brian Gumbel, which has just always kind of been the kind of storytelling that I've sought to do, and the level of journalism and the level of ethical coverage that I've always sought to do. And, meeting Bryant and Mary Carrillo and Soledad and Andrea Kramer and everyone has just been an absolute thrill. And being able to work with that whole team that very much takes the endeavor of journalism seriously has been a great experience. And now, I left The Athletic in December, and I have to be a little bit cagey about what I'm doing next, but I'm helping to found a company, not a media company, but a sports related company. And I'm continuing to do, Real Sports and continuing to have my foot in the journalism door. And, I'll be writing for NBC for some of the Olympic stuff and all of that. So that's a very long-winded career path there.
Thank you. That's super fascinating. And all those accomplishments, I wasn't necessarily aware of all of them, but I've been a huge fan of Real Sports for many years. My students know me as someone who is not the biggest sports person, but it's probably my favorite journalism show. So I'm going to open up to questions now. All of our students have come up with questions for you. Students, please approach the bench when you ask your question, introduce yourself. And you're going to have to do it sort of close to the camera. I don't know how. I'll aim it up when you come up. How about that? Okay. And then so she can hear you. And then you can step back to your seat. So whoever would like to go first. Jose, it's you. Thank you for volunteering. So remember, introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Hi, I'm Jose Vasquez. I've been in WACS News for 2 years now. I'm a junior. So I noticed in your interviews, you kind of base your answers off of, or your next question off of your interviewee's answers. Is there a way you learn to do that, or how do you make it seem so natural and more like a conversation than you actually asking questions?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and that's something that's fairly unique to this particular type of on-camera journalism, to being a correspondent on a TV show. When you're hosting a podcast, if it's a narrative podcast telling a similar story like this, you can ask more disjointed questions because that's it's easier to edit sound than it is to edit video. When you're interviewing for written, which is where most of my experience is, you want it to be more of a conversation. You want, you're trying to make the person comfortable. And it's a much more similar line of questioning for TV and for writing, where you really are, it's the act of listening while you're asking a question, and not necessarily trying to think of what to say next, but making sure you're hearing what the answer actually is, and that you're not missing information that your next question could be built on. That being said, when you go into any interview, no matter what the format of the piece is, you should always be extremely prepared with not just what your question is, but where you think that question might go. That's not to say that you have the answer in your head already, but you've done enough research on this person that hopefully you know where they're coming from, and you can think of the possibilities of how they might answer, so that you're not caught off guard. Then there will be something, in that HBO piece, we had to cut, it's a 15-minute segment, and we did about 14 hours of interviews. So you can imagine how much actually makes it in there. But when I was interviewing the youngest boy in California, there were a couple of things that he said that we just couldn't put in the piece, but that absolutely warranted follow-ups. And one of them was he started talking about his father and resentment that he felt there. And then you want to, that's not something that you expected him to say. So you're following up on that. And that's not to say that that wasn't important, and that's why it didn't make it in the piece. It just took away from, where the conversation actually ended up and where it was going. But yeah, you have to constantly be listening for what the interviewee is saying, and still somehow go in with a game plan, because there are going to be times when, as I'm doing right now, you're going to ask someone a question, they're going to give you 45 minutes of an answer, and you don't want any of it. And none of it is as particularly relevant to the question that you actually asked. So it's also striking that balance between listening to what the person is saying, deciding whether it's worthy of following up on, and also making sure that you're steering them back to the point, that you're not letting them avoid what you actually asked. You're not letting them go off on a tangent.
Thank you.
Who's next?
I think,
Go ahead.
wait, can you hear me from here?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I'm Sophie. I've been in WACS News for 2 years. And my question, I guess, is kind of like bouncing off that one. Did you have like a plan? Obviously you had a plan going into this video, but did it change a lot, or does it often change like in your stories after you've interviewed and like filmed people?
Yeah, I've only done 2 pieces for Real Sports, and my experience is, you adapt some things, and there's some things that, there's some times when you'll do a pre-interview, your producer, especially for video, you'll have a producer who does a pre-interview with anybody that you end up talking to on camera. And, when you're recording, or when the cameras are on, or even if you just have your phone in front of you and you're recording for a written interview and the person's not going to be featured anywhere, something about their demeanor changes, people clam up, and sometimes they don't answer, they don't say things that they've said publicly in the past, or that they've said to you in the past, right? And you can't really do anything about that. You can't put words in their mouth, you can't force them to say something. So there are times when you absolutely do have to pivot. Then there are some times, and hopefully, this is much easier to do in writing than it is to do in video or audio, but there are some times that you'll go in knowing exactly what your pitch to your editor was for a piece, what your angle was, and it'll end up being something completely different. Or the story you ended up going in to write ended up being a much smaller story than the story that ended up coming out of your interview. And, those are, you just have to roll with the punches a little bit. And those are times when you have to make really like conscious decisions with your editor and with your whole editorial team about what either makes it in the piece and what doesn't, or in the case of writing, like I just said, if the piece that you went in writing ended up being true, but a smaller part, how you turn this into a series. And that's a lot easier to do with articles, right? You come out with one, and it's kind of the drip of reporting, which is pretty traditional, good foundational reporting. It is difficult when you have to pivot. And I've definitely had producers, especially in audio, who really don't like when you have to pivot, but you also have to be strong enough to say, this is what's actually newsworthy. And just because it adds another 5 hours to our day, we kind of have to suck it up.
Thank you.
Great question. Who's next?
Hi, I'm Sarah. This is my first year of WACS News, and I was wondering, what amount of research does it take to find the right travel for like a specific story like this?
So as someone so the process for doing this for a place like HBO is much different than anything that I've done for my own podcast or for my written pieces, in that HBO has people do that for you. HBO, like you have, when you do a segment like Real Sports, you have a team of researchers, and you have a producer who goes out and, like I said, does those pre-interviews, finds those people. I tend to be more hands-on because I'm one of the only correspondents that is a daily sports reporter. So I have a lot more opinions and a lot more input on that. But when it comes to something like a Real Sports or like an ESPN 60 or something like that, there are people who do that research for you. Having done and continuing to do that research for the written side and for the audio side of things, it's hard. And the way that you start is you start by looking at who other people have talked to, and then you try and build from there. And one tenet I'm sure all of you have heard is, at the end of every interview, you always end it with two questions. One is there anything I asked you that you think that I didn't? Is there anything I didn't ask you about that you think is important for me to know? And the second is there anyone you recommend me talk to about this? Because the best sources for sources are other sources, and other reporters. So that's usually how I start that process. But it is a lot of, it's a lot of chasing people. It's a lot of figuring out who has said what where. You want to strike that balance between using people who have been reputable enough that other people you trust have interviewed them, but you also don't want to give the same person the same platform and the same mic. And when other people have recommended somebody, or just because you've seen this person in 3 other outlets, you still need to do your own vetting, and to make sure that that person has the expertise and the credentials and the background that somebody should have, that you're asking to be an authority on something. But yeah, a lot goes into that. And for a piece like the one that you saw, I mean, those are all ordinary individuals, right? None of those were star athletes, and none of them were particularly famous. So all of them were pretty much found by going to local news reporting. Student journalism and local reporting are some of the last bastions of proper on the ground reporting that we have in this country. And those are the stories that you're not going to necessarily hear from the Washington sports section, the Washington Post sports section. You're going to hear them from the Buffalo News sports section, or in the case of one of the families, the Sacramento Bee. And that's really, that's a good place to start.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Walker, and it's my first year in WACS News. And I was wondering, I have 2 questions. What is the travel like with your job? And who is the biggest athlete you've ever interviewed?
Everyone always asks you the second. So travel has been interesting with the pandemic, right? And one of the fears that we have as an industry is leagues have already kind of been trying to limit in-person access for reporters, and the pandemic gave them a really good, we had to stop traveling. Absolutely, we had to stop being inside with these games for a while. But it also gave them a perfect excuse to extend those rules after a time when it is actually safe. So travel has been limited. For a piece like the one that you saw, I mean, it was right after I'd gotten vaccinated, which was a little like right after I'd gotten vaccinated, in March or April. And it was, I think we did 4 cities in 3 days. And then a week after that, I took the Amtrak down to DC and did 2 days there. When in my regular day job, because, in my regular writing day job, I tend to cover national events. So I'm traveling for the Super Bowl and the World Series, and maybe the All-Star game. The draft is usually in New York, but hasn't, depending on which draft, has been moving around. So it's quite a bit. Beat writers, and some of my best friends are beat writers, and they're on the road 6 months out of the year. It's a really hard life. They live out of a suitcase, out of hotel rooms, especially baseball writers. 3 days at a time they're in a new city, and it's a lot of travel, but it's also a lot of fun. And this will be the first year in a while, minus the pandemic year, that that I won't be going to the Super Bowl. And, otherwise I would be in LA yesterday for the next 2 weeks. And then it's, nonstop press conferences and meetings and interviews, and then a party at the end, and then a press conference and a meeting and everything for basically 2 weeks. And it does kind of get exhausting, but it's also thrilling, and, adrenaline kicks in. The biggest athlete I've ever interviewed, it depends on, if like, I've interviewed Tom Brady and Peyton Manning. I've interviewed Derek Jeter. I'm on the board of directors of the Yogi Berra Museum, so I've just met a bunch of these guys also. We just did an event with David Cohn and Earl Monroe and Bernard King. I've interviewed Mark Messier. And you're just in a room full of people like all the time. So yeah.
Good question. Jake, my friend, you ready? It's your time to shine.
I know. How's my hair? by the way?
Your hair is good.
Okay, that's good. I don't want to get ugly.
It's all right.
So I have questions.
So Jake, make sure you introduce yourself.
Yes, I know that. My name is Jacob Stutka, and it's been my first year in WACS News, and I normally go by Jake, so like, yeah.
Hi, Jake.
Alright, so, oh my God, what an honor it is to, meet you, and like, you know what I mean?
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So, oh my God. So, okay, first, have you met Lin-Manuel Miranda, the creator of Hamilton?
I have interacted with Lin-Manuel. I've never met him in person, but I grew up in Washington Heights. So we have interacted as people who grew up in the same neighborhood. Yeah.
Are you in his movie?
I am not in his movie, but my parents still live in the Heights, and they filmed 2 blocks from my parents. And every time they saw a trailer, they would point out, that's our Rite Aid and that kind of thing.
All right, Jake, nice job. Thank you. All right, we probably have time for 1 or 2 more. We still have a few people who haven't asked. Floors are open. Zach, go ahead. Jake's questions always revolve around musical theater, so.
Fair enough.
He interviewed recently a cast member from Hamilton, so we hooked him up.
Well, I went to Juilliard, and I've actually played Broadway a couple of times, so I feel that love for sure.
Wow. Okay, Zach, you're up.
All right. Hello, my name is Zach. This is my first year in WACS News. And my question is, during a bunch of interviews in that one video we watched, there were shots of you in front of a computer screen with what was going on with the interview right in front of you. Where did you learn to do that? And do you have any tips on how to do it?
No, that was completely a pandemic thing. And if you see any of the pieces that I've done since then, we were able to do in-person interviews. But, there were a couple that we had to do virtually, both because of travel restrictions, because of, pandemic worries. We couldn't film outdoors, that kind of thing. It's very disconcerting, honestly, to have. And I mean, you guys know, having done in-person learning for as long as you did, it's just not the same to interact with somebody in person as it is to interact with someone on a screen. And this is something that goes back, I do a lot of like CNN and NBC and that kind of thing. And when you're in studio talking to someone versus when you're talking to a screen or a black box, it's a completely different energy. And I don't think it's something that you can teach. I think it's just something you pick up. And I mean, maybe you guys will have more of that skill because you've had to interact with people so much more on Zoom so much earlier in life than the rest of us. But yeah, it's definitely, it doesn't feel normal for sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
So 1 more, I think we got, Tyler. Oh, you can't. Okay, Kate. You're up.
He's nervous.
It's okay. Just be yourself.
Hi, my name's Kaden McCoy, and this is my first year in WACS News. And I was wondering how long it took you to put together that video that you shot.
Oh, I mean, so pre-interviews probably started, I mean, the research is at least a month or two of research that goes into that. The actual filming, like I said, I think we did 4 cities in 3 days over the course of 1 week. And then the next week I did 2 days in DC. So all total 6 days of shooting in about 2 weeks. And when did we finish? This was one that we put together much more quickly than usual. And I think that it took the producers another week or 2 to put together the final cut of that. And in the course of those 2 weeks, you're going back and forth. You probably do 21 edits in video form and in voiceover form of a piece like that. So, I mean, you're talking for something like that, a couple of months in the making, plus another at least month of production.
That's really interesting because like we have 2-week cycles here. We ask a lot of our students in terms of setting up interviews and putting research into them. To do a piece of journalism like that, and it takes a whole team of people, probably 3 months, on the outside to put together. So of course we're not asking.
And millions and millions of dollars.
And billions of dollars as well. So, but I am one to think, shoot for the stars, So we just want to say thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciated your time and your energy and your work, and you really inspired us a lot today. So we just want to give you a round of applause and say thank you.
Well, thank you guys so much. And, I love talking to students, and I think that there aren't enough journalism students and there aren't enough people who take journalism seriously. And I truly believe you guys can be our future. So thank you guys so much.
Thanks again.
you.
All right, have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.